Prestige does not appear naturally. It is not the inevitable result of intelligence, excellence, or even achievement. Prestige is constructed through policy decisions, legal frameworks, financial design, and sustained proximity to power over long periods of time. When people talk about the Ivy League, they often talk about reputation. But reputation is not an explanation. It is the visible surface of deeper systems. Welcome to the Global Campus channel. I'm Adeola Komalafe Eloem, and this is where we explore the world's most influential universities, not just by reputation, but by impact. Here, we examine the ideas they produce, the people they shape, and the role they play in shaping our future. In this episode, we examine the Ivy League not as a myth, not as branding, and not as a measure of educational quality, but as a historically produced system. A system shaped by timing, by institutional restraint, by capital accumulation, and by alignment with political and economic authority. We will ask how 8 universities came to dominate the global imagination and why the conditions that made that dominance possible are now being tested. Formally, the Ivy League is a mid-20th century athletic agreement among 8 private universities in the northeastern United States. It does not accredit institutions. It does not define academic standards. It does not guarantee educational quality. There is no legal authority behind the term, and yet globally, Ivy League functions as a proxy for intellectual authority, elite status, and institutional trust. That authority was not created by the league itself. It emerged because the universities that later formed the Ivy League were already embedded in systems of power before the term existed. The label came later. Before Ivy League meant elite education, it meant age. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many of the oldest universities in the northeastern United States shared a visible characteristic: ivy growing up on stone buildings. Ivy became a cultural shorthand for permanence, slow growth, endurance, institutional continuity. There was even a formal ritual known as planting the ivy, where graduating classes planted ivy as a symbol that the institution would outlast any individual. Sports journalists began informally referring to those old colleges as the Ivies when they competed against one another long before the league was formalized. The term did not create prestige. It named something people already recognized, and once named, that recognition hardened into identity. The roots of Ivy League influence predate the United States. Colonial-era universities were founded to educate clergy, lawyers, administrators, and governing elites. They were chartered by colonial authorities. They trained people who would staff courts, assemblies, and early bureaucracies. At the time, there was no public university system, no mass access, no alternative pathway at scale. Elite education was protected not by law but by scarcity. Institutions that educate early ruling classes often become structurally intertwined with governance itself. That intertwining tends to persist long after the original political order disappears. In 1862, American higher education reached a decisive fork. The Morrill Land Grants Act funded public universities designed to teach agriculture, engineering, and applied science, institutions built to educate the workforce and develop national capacity. This created a parallel system. Public universities expanded, enrollment scaled, applied research flourished. Elite private universities made a different choice. They did not attempt to compete on skill. They remained small, selective, and research-oriented. They focused on shaping leaders, theorists, and institutional elites rather than training the workforce. This decision froze a hierarchy. Ivy League prestige It's not only about what these universities became, it is about what they chose not to become. World War II transformed universities into instruments of state power. Federal funding poured into defense research, medicine, physics, and engineering, but funding followed readiness. Universities with existing laboratories, elite faculty, and administrative capacity were positioned to absorb large grants. Once that flow began, it reinforced itself. Research output increased, graduate programs expanded, prestige became measurable and self-reinforcing. This was not favoritism, it was path dependency. Institutions that were ready early did not simply receive funding, they were structurally reshaped by it. A question is, does excellence attract funding, or does funding manufacture excellence over time? One of the most consequential forces behind Ivy League dominance is rarely discussed: U.S. non-profit tax law. Private universities benefit from tax-exempt endowment growth, charitable giving incentives, no mandatory distribution requirements. This allowed elite institutions to accumulate capital indefinitely. Endowments are not savings accounts, they are perpetual investment vehicles. Most Ivy League universities spend only 4 to 5% annually, calculated using multi-year averages. This means universities are less dependent on tuition fees and better protected when the economy weakens. Universities that accumulated wealth early developed advantages that continue to increase over generations. Early wealth funds better facilities, attracts stronger faculty, supports more research, and signals stability to donors, all of which attract further wealth. Endowment figures represent total market value, not annual income. By the early mid-2020s, Harvard exceeded $50 billion. Yale and Princeton held tens of billions of dollars. Columbia and Penn sat in the mid-single digit to low tens. Brown remained in single-digit billions. At a 5% payout, $50 billion generates roughly $2.5 billion annually. $5 billion generates roughly $250 million. The gap compounds every year financially, reputationally, and politically. Elite admissions are not purely retrospective, they are prospective. The Charles Kushner donation to Harvard in the late 1990s is not proof of illegality, but it is illustrative of how proximity works. At this level, admissions are not just about achievement, they are about visibility, familiarity, and perceived trajectory. When thousands of applicants are exceptional, being known can matter. Elite institutions ask, if we attach our name to this person, what happens next? Admissions become a form of long-term investment, not just selection. Another question here is, if admissions are about future return, how early does the signaling begin? Let us explore the 8 universities' historical mechanisms of power. This is where abstraction fails, so we look directly at history. Harvard, authority through crisis. In 1849, Harvard was shaken by the disappearance of George Parkman, a wealthy benefactor of Harvard Medical School. Parkman was later found murdered by John White Webster, a Harvard professor. The trial became historic because, for the first time, forensic dentistry was accepted as legal evidence to identify human remains. Harvard converted internal catastrophe into institutional authority. It helped establish scientific expertise as legal truth, reinforcing the university's position at the intersection of law, medicine, and governance. Princeton, elite education as political architecture. Princeton has long positioned itself as a university of public service, but its influence goes far beyond rhetoric. It has functioned as a training ground for governing elites. Woodrow Wilson served as president of Princeton before becoming president of the United States. Later, Princeton formalized its role in statecraft through what is now the School of Public and International Affairs, an institution explicitly designed to shape policymakers, diplomats, and strategic thinkers. Princeton alumni have occupied the highest levels of American political life, from the presidency to cabinet positions to advisory roles in moments of national crisis. Its graduates were also embedded in Cold War strategy, including participation in the intellectual and technical ecosystems that supported the Apollo program. This matters because the space race was not an academic curiosity, it was geopolitical theater. Princeton illustrates a key mechanism of Ivy League power. Elite universities do not merely educate leaders after power is formed, they help design the frameworks through which power operates. Columbia, economic power without moral synchrony. Columbia is one of the largest private landowners in New York City. Yet, Columbia College did not admit women until 1983. This gap reveals a persistent pattern. Elite institutions often adapt economically long before they adapt socially. Prestige can coexist with exclusion, sometimes for decades. Yale, networks that outlast office. Yale's Skull and Bones Society is not folklore. Its alumni include a striking number of intelligence and national security figures. This reflects how elite institutions reproduce trust networks, not just credentials. Power circulates through familiarity. Yale has been one of those circulation points. Cornell, skill, pressure, and institutional design. Cornell occupies a distinctive position within the Ivy League. It combines elite status with land grant origins, meaning it was built both for prestige and for public purpose. That dual identity created skill. Cornell is larger, broader, and more structurally complex than most of its Ivy peers. Over time, intense academic pressure, isolation, and the physical geography of the campus, including its deep gorges, converged in tragic ways. A series of student suicides forced the university to install safety nets over these gorges. The response was practical, but the moment was structural. It raised a difficult question. What happens when an institution expands ambition and expectations faster than it can redesign the system that supports the people inside it? Cornell's experience reveals that prestige does not only generate opportunity, it also generates pressure, and pressure, if unmanaged, exposes the limits of institutional design. University of Pennsylvania, legitimacy under contest. Penn's history includes student occupations during the Vietnam War. This matters because elite institutions often claim neutrality while benefiting from state power. Penn demonstrates that legitimacy within elite systems is not uncontested. It is negotiated, sometimes violently. Brown, capital, naming, and the permanence of early advantage. In the early 19th century, a donation of $5,000 secured something far more valuable than a building or a scholarship. It secured a name. That contribution, modest even by the standards of its time, and roughly equivalent to perhaps $100,000 to $200,000 today, permanently attached the Brown family name to the university. Let's examine the pattern. What we've just examined are not isolated stories. They are not colorful footnotes in institutional history. They are structural moves. A crisis becomes an opportunity to expand authority. A donation becomes a permanent layer of identity. A private network becomes a pipeline into governance. Prestige becomes a shield against volatility. Over time, these conversions accumulate. This is how institutional power actually grows, not through perfection, but through adaptation. The Ivy League did not rise because it avoided contradiction. It rose because it absorbed contradiction, stabilized it, and turned it into reinforcement. Where other institutions fracture under pressure, elite institutions redesign themselves just enough to survive, and in surviving, they strengthen. Durability is not an accident. It is engineered, but engineered systems are still systems, and systems eventually face competition. The Ivy League did not collapse, but it did encounter institutions that challenged its centrality in new ways. So who actually challenged the Ivy League? For most of its history, the Ivy League did not face open rivals, it faced alternatives, and the most serious challenges did not come from institutions trying to imitate its exclusivity. They came from institutions that rejected it. The Big Ten, skill as power. The Big Ten Academic Alliance did not attempt to out-prestige the Ivy League. It overwhelmed it with skill. Universities like Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and later UCLA built vast research infrastructures, enrolled tens of thousands of students, and produced PhDs at industrial levels. Collectively, they outspent the Ivy League in research. They dominated engineering, medicine, and applied science. Where the Ivy League concentrated on prestige, the Big Ten concentrated capacity. It asked a quiet but destabilizing question. If knowledge production happens at scale elsewhere, how central is the Ivy League really? The other one is the Association of American Universities, output as legitimacy. The AAU reframed the conversation entirely. It did not care about heritage. It cared about research output, federal funding, doctoral strength. Membership was based on measurable performance. And within that group sit institutions that equal or exceed Ivy League universities in research dominance. MIT, Stanford, Berkeley. The message was subtle but powerful. Prestige is not the same as productivity. That shift did not erase the Ivy League, but it diluted the assumption that heritage equals superiority. These institutions built direct ties to industry, technology, and innovation. They did not rely on historical symbolism. They built relevance through impact. By the late 20th century, it became entirely normal to say MIT or Stanford is as prestigious as any Ivy. That sentence would have been unthinkable a century earlier. Prestige had expanded geographically. The center had shifted. The Russell Group, replication without imitation. Across the Atlantic, the Russell Group did not attempt to defeat the Ivy League, it studied it. It replicated the formula: collective branding, research concentration, policy alignment, but within a public system. It proved something profound. The Ivy League was not a miracle. It was a model, and models can be reproduced. No one ever defeated the Ivy League by replacing it. No rival league emerged in America. No expansion absorbed it. Instead, its dominance was diluted. Knowledge production decentralized. Research power dispersed. Elite status diversified. The Ivy League did not collapse. It became less singular. Its power did not disappear. It became less necessary, and that distinction matters because institutions built on centrality must confront a world that no longer revolves around them. Let us examine AI, credentials, and the stress test ahead. Artificial intelligence does not threaten universities in the way previous technologies did. It does not replace lecture halls. It does not eliminate laboratories. It does not dissolve campuses. Its disruption is quieter and potentially more destabilizing. AI threatens credential trust. For centuries, universities have functioned as verification systems. They certify that a student has mastered material, produced original thought, and demonstrated competence under supervision. The degree is not just proof of learning, it is proof of authenticated learning. But when machines can generate essays, solve problem sets, draft code, simulate research proposals, and even tutor students in real time, traditional forms of assessment begin to blur. If an essay can be written by a model, what exactly is being measured? If problem solving can be assisted invisibly, what is being certified? When assessment weakens, credential clarity weakens. And when credential clarity weakens, prestige becomes unstable, because prestige depends on trusted differentiation. Elite universities understand this. That is why they are not responding with panic band stands alone. They are centralizing AI governance, forming task forces, rewriting academic integrity policies, redesigning assessments, and integrating AI into curricula rather than pretending it does not exist. This is not just educational reform, it is institutional self-preservation. Here is where endowments matter again. Large endowments buy time. They allow universities to experiment without existential risk, to pilot new forms of assessment, to absorb reputational mistakes, to shape regulatory conversations. Smaller institutions do not have this margin. They must react. Elite institutions can redefine, but the deeper question is not technological, it is philosophical. If AI reduces the cost of high-quality instruction, if expertise becomes more accessible, if learning can occur outside traditional gatekeepers, then what exactly is the university selling? Is it knowledge, access, network, signal? This stress test is not whether AI will change education. It already is. The real question is who gets to define excellence in an AI-augmented world, and whether the institutions that build prestige in an era of scarcity can adapt to an era of abundance. Because the Ivy League was engineered in a world where information was limited and access was controlled, AI operates in a world where information is everywhere. Scarcity built prestige. Abundance tests it. The Ivy League's power was not accidental. It was built through timing, policy, capital, and proximity to authority. Those forces still operate, but the environment has changed. Knowledge is less scarce. Access is less controlled. Credentials are under new scrutiny. The Ivy League will survive. The real question is whether institutions built in an era of scarcity can redefine excellence in an era of abundance. Policy explains how power was built. Adaptation will decide whether it remains central. If this analysis changed how you see institutional power, consider subscribing to Global Campus. Each episode examines the system behind prestige, policy, and influence, not just the surface. This is Global Campus.